Good evening, everybody. So just before we start, I'll just ask everyone to check that their phones are on the do not embarrass me mode. If that mode doesn't exist on your phone, just put it on quiet. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us this evening for what is actually a very, very important topic. And you might think it's important because over the last number of years, there's been a lot of research that has now come out and been filtered into the public, moved beyond the medical world, with phrases like the gut is our second brain, and all sorts of other ideas around the importance of the health of our gut. And then that has led to a broader conversation around fermentation and the foods that we eat and the impact that this is having on our body, and then moving backwards in time to the wisdom of fermentation, something that has existed across many of the ancient civilizations and cultures. And was it just to help them get through winter, or was there something deeper to fermentation? And I suppose that answer will not be provided tonight unless we're in for a surprise. We're going to look more at fermentation in the present day, and more importantly, how to. But why is it that I feel that this is such an important topic? Well, from a spiritual perspective, a healthy gut, and based on the research that's coming out month by month around gut health, there is a very, very important outcome for our spiritual development and therefore for our holistic development that we're going to explore tonight. Every person has 5 levels of a soul: nefesh, ruach, neshama, chai, and yechida. Chai and yechida are not elements of our soul that exist within ourself. It's like an extension cord. There's a part that plugs into the appliance and another part that plugs into the energy source. Yechida is the part that plugs into the origin, the energy source itself. It basically is energy. The chai is the energy as it surrounds us. It's almost like photosynthesis. It's this energy that pulsates and vibrates and moves through us and animates us, but it never actually docks or anchors itself to our guf, to our body. These lower 3 elements of the soul are like the 3 prongs that plug into an appliance, and our body is the appliance. The nefesh is the part of the soul that is responsible for our life itself. If you are alive, if you exist, you have a nefesh. Our ruach is our spirit. Our ruach is our energy. It is our emotional response to everything and anything that takes place in our life. And our neshama is the part of the soul that's responsible for giving us cognitive ability. It's the part of the soul that integrates itself fully with the mind, with the brain. And each of these aspects of our soul work completely in sync with each other. They are a single unit, much like your hands, your legs, and your head are all part of a single unit. They have different functions, but they are one. The reason why this is very important that we explore our gut health is because for a body and soul to have a true synergistic existence, and in order for the soul to truly flow through every element of ourselves, we need our body to be ra'ui. It has to be fit to be able to withhold and take the energy of the soul along for this journey that we call life. Conversely, a soul needs to be healthy. It's not enough to just have a healthy body. But tonight we're looking at things from the body's point of view. If there is a physical problem with our body, then our soul is not able to flow through us freely, and it's not able to animate us to its full potential, and therefore we are missing out on our own capacity. With the rise of the research into gut health, and with the rise of the research into fermentation, this is a crucial topic because so much of our health is actually not dependent just on our brain and just on our head and just on our heart, But there is this whole other part of our body that is contributing to whether or not our soul, our nefesh itself, is actually having the effect and the impact that we would like it to have on our body. Because a person whose soul is completely in sync with the body is a person who can reach enlightenment. It's a person who can reach open-mindedness. It's a person who can reach a position of discipline and able to affect others, and is able to create a positive reality in this world. And so tonight is actually not a health lecture. It is a lecture about how our soul can best function in our body. We are exploring this from the physiological, from a health perspective, because that is the way that this world has been designed. We're using the observations of science and the cutting-edge research to ensure that we are not only a healthy person, but that we can actually live to the greatest capacity, one in which our body and our soul are completely united. Tonight we've got two special presenters. We've got Maryasha and Irina. Maryasha has never presented to this crowd, although she has presented to a Spirit Grow crowd before at our young adult events. And for those of you who would be interested in that, there are a number of young adult flyers in the front. And I just raised that because there's a feature Friday night event for you. But Maryasha brings a wealth of practical knowledge as well as practical application. And tonight she's actually going to allow you to experience the product of fermentation. She is wise, but she is also excellent at bringing it into the here and now, because the best way to learn is through eating. Irina, I would hope that everyone here knows, because Irina's presented over the years many, many times, and Irina at different points in Spirit Grow's history was actually responsible for putting together many of the health lectures that you've come to, but most importantly tonight is built on the back of her work that she's put in over the years at Spirit Grow. Irina has a wealth of knowledge, and what I like about her is that she is slightly left of center when it comes to the wisdom teachings of health and nutrition. I say left of center not because she's alternative, but because she's ahead of where a lot of the world of nutrition is at. She is very much up to date with the science and not so much stuck in whatever was being taught 10 years ago. And it's an absolute joy to have someone who is so advanced and a genuine leader in the world of nutrition, and someone who is so freely available to answer anyone's questions. I'd like to give the mic over to Irina first. I'd like to give the mic over to Irina and then over to Maryasha. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks, Menachem. Is that on? Yeah. Okay, thanks. Thank you for that introduction. If you're ever having a bad day, you should just come give a talk at Spirit Grow and you can get a big ego boost with an introduction. Thanks a lot. It's really great to be back here. It's been a couple of years since I last presented here. And it's really nice to see so many of you again. So tonight's topic, I was asked to come and speak about fermentation. And if you allow me, I just want to go on a small related tangent before we get into fermentation itself and speak about an organ, so to say. Menachem alluded this to a little bit before, that you might not be aware of, or maybe you already are. It weighs about 2 kilos, so slightly more than the brain. It's composed of about 10 to 100 trillion cells. It varies quite a bit from person to person, and it can actually tell us quite a lot about any individual state of health. So I'm talking about our microbiome, of course, which is a hot word right now in all the research and literature out there. So the microbiome is, technically speaking, it's actually the name given to the collection of genes, but people talk about it as a ecosystem of billions and billions of microorganisms, so bacteria, yeast, protozoa, viruses that live in and around our body. And they're actually tightly associated with our health. So there are about 10 trillion, the estimates are still out there. There's, back in the was it 20 years ago or more, we had the Human Genome Project. Now there's the Human Microbiome Project. And scientists are trying to sequence all the DNA of all of these microorganisms that live on humans and inside humans. So the estimates are still out there. It's about 10 trillion cells live in our gastrointestinal tract alone. We have others on our skin and in our mouth and other parts of our body. And these cells actually do things for the body that our body wouldn't be able to do without them. So they're involved in metabolism, digestion, they're important for our immune function, and even for our brain health. And we know that, as I said before, the microbiome is tightly associated with our health because the microorganisms that are living there live in a symbiotic relationship with us, which means that we give them a home. We provide food for them in the form of fiber, which we can't digest. That's the parts of food that we can't digest. They feed on that, and in turn, they give us something back. So it's a give and take relationship. Nobody's a winner, nobody's a loser. I guess we're both winners. So they're actually responsible, these microorganisms living in our gut are responsible for many metabolic and signaling functions, which, like I said, our body can't perform on its own. So, for example, they make B vitamins all the way from B1 to B12, vitamin K, amino acids, short-chain fatty acids, which is also another big area of research right now. They're involved in the anti-inflammatory pathways in our body and lowering blood pressure. So it's actually these bugs that live in our gut that help us to have these health benefits. And we know that the microbiome is very involved in health and disease. So there's a big body of research that says that gastrointestinal diseases like Crohn's, irritable bowel syndrome, inflammatory bowel disease, as well as metabolic disorders like obesity and certain neurological disorders are all associated with changes or alterations in our gut microbiome. Another word for that is dysbiosis. So we know that a lot of studies have been done in mice, and many of them are now also being replicated in humans, because there's always people say, okay, in mice, fine, it's one thing, you can show all this stuff, but does it really translate to people? And now that the research is really happening, we see that a lot of the findings that we first saw in mice are actually also hold for humans. So for example, we know that mice who are fed artificial sweeteners, so things like Splenda and all the other ones like saccharin and those artificial sweeteners, they actually have higher blood glucose levels, so which is an indicator of general health, but as well as a predictor of diabetes. So they have more glucose, more sugar in their blood than mice who eat straight up sugar. And the researchers were very perplexed by this because we've always known, or we've always been told, that the artificial sweeteners are inert, they don't have any calories, they don't affect our body in any way besides for signaling to us that it tastes sweet. But we always thought up until recently that they don't have any other effect on our body. But now we know that these artificial sweeteners, although they don't affect anything else, they affect our microbiome very significantly. And the effect that they have on it is unfortunately a negative effect, because then it makes mice, and this has now been shown in humans as well, be unable to metabolize glucose in the normal way. So we know that our diet is associated with the microbiome, which then in turn affects our health and the way that we can digest food and metabolize food. We know as well that mice who are anxious mice, I always imagine these little mice sitting there in their like little cages shivering. Anxious mice and mice who are more relaxed have very different microbiome profiles. So they have different amounts of bacteria, different kinds of bacteria in their gastrointestinal tract. And what's interesting is that if you take the gut bacteria from the mice who are relaxed and you transplant them into the anxious mice chill out. So it doesn't only have an effect on our metabolism and our digestion, it actually affects our brain. And that's because the microorganisms living in our gut actually communicate with our brain. They produce neurotransmitters like serotonin and GABA and dopamine. They also use hormones like cortisol, ghrelin, and leptin to communicate with our central nervous system and brain. And they also use the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So they're not just isolated simply to our gut and our large intestine. They really communicate with the rest of the body. They have a big impact on the immune system as well. They're our first line of defense against pathogens. So in someone who has a healthy microbiome, hopefully they're there, they step in, they help to fight off all the bad things. What we also know is that not only with the mice, but in humans, the microbiomes of obese people are very different to those of their lean counterparts. So they have less beneficial bacteria and less variety of beneficial bacteria to people who are lean. And that actually makes those people be able to extract more energy from the same food than the people who are lean. Very interesting. And this has been shown in mice, and I think it's being replicated in humans as well right now, but you'll understand that there's some ethics issues, obviously. So if you take an obese mouse and take its gut bacteria, and they put them into these germ-free mice. Germ-free mice basically means that they have absolutely no microbiome of their own. They don't have any bacteria living in their gut. They kept in these very special apparatuses where the scientists have to wear full bodysuits and make sure nobody gives them any of their own germs. So they put the microbiome of the obese mice into germ-free mice, and those mice that had no microbiome of their own before became obese. And the same is true for the lean mice. If you take the microbiome of a lean mouse and you put it into the gastrointestinal tract of a germ-free mouse, they become lean. So we see that there's a very tight association. And we now know that just by looking at someone's microbiome profile, a person's, not just a mouse's, we can predict with 90% accuracy whether that person is obese or not. And that might not sound so interesting to you because everyone sitting in this room can predict with almost 100% certainty whether someone's obese just by looking at them. We don't need the microbiome to tell us that. But what's interesting is that if you're looking at someone's genes, just purely at their genes, we can only predict whether they're going to be obese or lean with 60% certainty. So the microbiome is a much better indicator for that. And again, it proves to us that it is tightly associated with our health. And what's exciting about the microbiome is, unlike our genes, we can alter the microbiome. So we know our genes, we get them, we're born with them. Yes, there's a lot of things about epigenetics going on right now and switching on and off genes, but you're still stuck with the same genes that you were born with. Whereas with the microbiome, we can actually change it for the good and for the bad. So I want to talk tonight a bit about how can we look after our microbiome, make sure that it's healthy. So up until very recently, it was thought that right before a baby was born, they also had a sterile gastrointestinal tract, so they had no microbes living in there, and that they first, when they come out and they get exposed to their mother's vaginal microbiome, it begins to colonize their gut. We actually now know, in much more recent research, that a mother actually starts to give the beginnings of the baby's microbiome in utero, and then it begins to take shape after the birth. So, and just as a quick aside, and this is in no way meant to make anyone feel guilty or feel bad, scientists think that the increased rates of obesity, asthma, allergies, and other conditions that are to do with cesarean sections, they think it might be because of this, that the baby's not exposed straight away to the microbiome of the mother, and so then it has trouble already to start with. But, as I said, there's nothing to worry about because we can change the microbiome, which is very exciting. So one of the ways that it's done, and this is a very, very young stage of research, there's a lot more research that needs to be done, is fecal microbiota transplant. That is what it sounds, is there's a donor with a healthy microbiome, they give a stool sample, and it gets transplanted into somebody who's not healthy. And there have been some very promising results in there, but as I said, there's still a lot more research. This is a very hot topic right now, so watch this space in the future. This is where a lot of the experiments and trials are going right now. But I'm not here to talk to you about that tonight. I wanted to discuss how we can alter or upkeep our microbiome through diet, because that's what I know about. So just before we get on to that, I wanted to share with you a short video that's from the Weizmann Institute in Israel. These are researchers, it already came out a couple of years ago, that took a group of people, and you'll see the video will talk for itself about how important our microbiome is to do with our health. So hopefully this will work.
When we eat, the carbohydrates from the food are broken down to simple sugars, which are then absorbed from our intestine into the bloodstream. Blood sugar levels are a key factor that affects the pathogenesis of diseases such as diabetes and obesity. Diets aimed at controlling blood glucose levels are often similar, even for different people. But what if we told you that these very common diets aimed at maintaining stable blood sugar levels may in some people achieve the exact opposite? How is this possible? People are different in many ways. For example, in their genetic makeup, in their lifestyle, and also in their microbiomes. The microbiome is a huge ecosystem of trillions of bacteria living inside our body, with more than 100 times the number of genes contained in the human genome. The microbiome is influenced by what we eat, and in turn affects our response to food. And as the microbiome differs greatly from one person to another, it can also affect the blood sugar response to food. For the past few years, scientists at the Weizmann Institute have studied the factors underlying variations in post-meal blood sugar responses. They collected health and lifestyle data from 800 volunteers who were connected to a device that monitored their blood sugar level every 5 minutes for an entire week. The participants also used a mobile app to document what and when they ate, exercised, slept, and so on. Stool samples were collected in order to analyze the composition and activity of their microbiomes. The scientists discovered that when different people ate identical foods, they often reacted in a very different way. For example, the blood sugar level of some people rose more significantly after eating sushi than after eating ice cream. The scientists were able to integrate all of the data they collected into an algorithm that successfully predicted the blood sugar response to the meals of the 800 participants. The same algorithm achieved similar accuracy when predicting the sugar responses of 100 new participants. The scientists also showed how the algorithm could be used to prescribe personalized diets. A good diet that lowers post-meal sugar response, and a bad diet that raises sugar responses. Interestingly, some foods that appeared on the good diet of one person appeared on the bad diet of another. Let's hear what the researchers themselves have to say.
If I highlight the key contributions of our work, I would say that the first is in highlighting the need for personalized nutrition, which we demonstrate by showing that the blood sugar response of different people to identical meals can be hugely different. And as soon as we saw this data, we realized that general dietary recommendations given to the entire population may have limited efficacy. The second is in then measuring for every individual in our nearly 1,000 people cohort a very comprehensive profile that includes their medical background, questionnaires, physical activity, blood tests, and gut microbiome function and composition, and then integrating this data into a computational algorithm that could successfully predict the personalized blood glucose response of people to arbitrary meals. And then finally, in showing that applying this algorithm to design personally tailored dietary interventions in individuals could significantly lower their blood sugar response to food, and that was accompanied by consistent alterations to the gut microbiome.
We know that nutrition is a very important risk factor for human metabolic disease, and especially to the obesity and diabetes epidemics that are affecting the lives of close to half of the world's population. In this work, we link nutrition in a personalized manner to human risk to develop elevated blood sugar levels and their many complications. As scientists, we often deal with very basic questions, but in this work, we are very happy to also introduce a potential that, if further developed, would allow to benefit the health of millions across the world.
This research marks an important step towards personalized nutrition by predicting post-meal blood glucose responses. The scientists hope that this approach will help to achieve a healthier lifestyle and prevent metabolic disease worldwide.
Okay. All right, let me see if I can go to my next slide. 1 second. Okay. So as you can see, the microbiome is really important for our health. And I want to talk about how do we maintain, or how do we change our microbiome to be healthy. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to be able to feed our good bacteria. Our probiotics is another word for it, that give us all the health benefits that we discussed. We want to feed them and make sure that they have everything that they need to continue doing what they're doing. So how do we do that? We eat fiber, which another word for it is prebiotics. So it allows the probiotics to continue to live. So fiber, as we know, there's no surprises here. Where do we find it? In our good friends, the fruit and veggies. I don't think you'll find any nutritionist or health experts anywhere, no matter how much people disagree on fat and sugar and should we be eating paleo or this or that. Everybody agrees that we should be eating plenty of fruit and vegetables. And if you've ever heard me talk, you know I always say eat the rainbow every day. It ensures that you are consuming a wide variety of fibers and also in an adequate amount. If you really try to eat a fruit and vegetables that are red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple, you will cover everything that you need. Other sources of fiber are, unrefined grains, like whole grains, oats, brown rice, that kind of thing. Nuts and seeds and legumes as well is really good too. So that way we're feeding our good, beneficial organisms in our gut so that they can actually survive and keep doing what they need to do. Another thing, as we mentioned before, is we want to try and avoid artificial sweeteners because we know that they have a negative impact on our microbiome, and the same has actually been now shown to be true for emulsifiers. Emulsifiers are substances that help to keep things smooth. So like there's a component that's hydrophilic and one that's lipophilic, so they can help to bring fat and water solutions to be a good consistency. So they're used in ice creams and mayonnaise and a lot of processed foods. You'll find if you read the labels, it'll have all these emulsifiers in like chocolates and a lot of other stuff. And it's now been shown that emulsifiers have a similar effect to artificial sweeteners. They negatively impact our microbiome, which makes us be able to not be able to metabolize food in the most optimal way. So we want to try and stay away from that, and which is this stuff. And the other thing is avoid antibiotics where possible. It's pretty known these days now. You go to the doctor, they don't just generally prescribe you antibiotics. It really has to be serious. So I feel like it's great. We've come a long way. And also try and avoid too much of these antibacterial soaps and wipes and everything being a super, super duper sterile environment, because we do need to be exposed to the pathogens. We need to be exposed to everything. We don't want to have pathogens, but we want our body to be exposed to it maybe in small amounts so that it can build its own immune response to it rather than relying on this stuff. So we want to basically be having that kind of rainbow instead of that kind of rainbow in our diet. And the other thing that we can do, besides for keeping what we have healthy, is that we can introduce more good bacteria into our gut. And how do we do that? Is with probiotics. Probiotics is a very known term these days, as Menachem mentioned. We know that they help to protect against disease, they improve digestion and enhance immune function, and it's everywhere. You can get the Health Plus tablets, you can get things, but I'm a big believer in getting it from food. I think that it's better that way. I think you're going to get more variety that way instead of like 2 or 3 strains, and I think you're going to get more of it, and it's more fun and exciting, and you get all the other health benefits. So some foods that contain probiotics are pickled vegetables like sauerkraut and kimchi and just homemade pickles. Kefir, which is really cool. Since I last spoke here 2 or 3 years ago, there's like kefir in the regular Coles supermarket now. You can get it. It's kosher and Chalav Yisrael too, the Table of Plenty one. And kombucha as well is just huge. It's like everywhere now. It's the new thing. I don't know, again, the ones that are sold in the supermarkets and at the petrol stations and that are going to be everywhere, if they're necessarily as healthy as the ones that you can make at home, but I think that it's pretty good. Miso and, of course, sourdough bread, which we're going to hear about soon from Maryasha. So those are just some ideas of how to get that into our system. And that brings us finally to the topic of fermentation, tonight's lecture. So how do we get foods to have probiotics in them? And that's through fermentation. So fermentation is just a fancy word for the breakdown of sugars into organic acids, alcohol, and gases. Alcohol fermentation is done by yeast, so that's used to make wine and beer as well as bread. And lactic acid fermentation is done by bacteria, and we take advantage of that when we make fermented dairy, drinks, and pickled vegetables. So we know that fermentation creates beneficial enzymes, the B vitamins, vitamin K, the short-chain fatty acids, and probiotics, and we want to have all of those things in our gut. And another thing that might not seem so exciting to us these days is that fermentation helps to preserve foods. And this is how, way before it was trendy to eat sauerkraut and drink kombucha, it was used by people for thousands of years to actually make their food last longer. There was no refrigeration, there were no preservatives, and that's what people did. So we know that there's actually archaeological evidence for humans using fermentation to produce drinks dating back to the Neolithic age. So about 8,000 years ago is the first evidence that we have. And then later, about 4,000 years ago, in China, in India, in ancient Egypt, and in Babylon, we have evidence that people were using fermentation to create different drinks. And the word fermentation is actually from the Latin fervere, which means to boil, because people observe that when you leave fruits or grains covered for a long time, they produce bubbles. So it looked like as if it's been boiled. And of course, they didn't know what the mechanisms behind it were, and it wasn't all systemized, and we didn't know what factors made it do that, but people observed that that's what it did. And in the 1850s, the French chemist and microbiologist Louis Pasteur actually showed that fermentation is initiated by living organisms, by yeast. Before that, it was thought that yeast was just a chemical that wasn't alive, that was needed to kind of catalyze fermentation, but now we know that it's a living organism, and that's what does it. So I think enough of theory and history for now. I'm going to do a quick little demonstration of how to brew your own kombucha. I brought mine from home, and I'll show you how quick and easy it is, and we now know all the health benefits of it. So hopefully it will inspire you to do the same at home. And when I'm done with the kombucha, Maryasha is going to talk about sourdough bread and how to do that. Okay. So I'm first going to wash my hands really well with soap, because I want to make sure that I'm not going to contaminate anything with any germs that I might have on my hands. Okay, so I've got my little basket here. Ta-da. All right, so this is my kombucha that I've had from before, and you'll see I'll take out the SCOBY. The SCOBY stands for symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast, which is what performs the fermentation. That's all you need. Otherwise, you just need tea and sugar, and that's it. It's very simple. It's just a fermented tea drink. Okay. So, just take out all my things. All right. Okay, I'll take it out and I'll show it to you. You leave it covered so that nothing yucky gets inside, and you just leave it out at room temperature. I have it sitting on top of my pantry. It doesn't need any sunlight. It's really a very, very low maintenance thing. And this is what the SCOBY looks like. It's kind of a bit of a slimy, alien looking thing. And that's the bacteria and the yeast that are doing the fermentation in here. So I'm just gonna take them out of the one that you've got happening. I actually have a few living in here. It's like the SCOBY Hotel. And you set aside a little bit of the kombucha that you've already had before to start the next batch. It's sort of like the starter in sourdough. So you need that. I'll set that aside and I'll just cover it so that nothing yucky gets inside. And now what I'm going to do is actually, this is called a secondary fermentation. I'll pull out the other one in a minute. You'll see, hopefully, how happy this is. I'm just going to pour a little bit of sugar inside here. The cool thing about it is that the bacteria and the yeast and the SCOBY will metabolize all the sugar. So it's actually a very low sugar drink. It's definitely an acquired taste. I really like it. My kids love it. But you might not be so used to it right away. So I'm just going to, I have a little strainer here. I'm just going to pour this into here.
Irina, so you're using white sugar there, but
Yeah.
sometimes they recommend to use unprocessed.
This is like an unrefined sugar. It's not like white sugar that you get in the supermarket. I use the Billington's brand. It's like a less refined version of sugar. The truth is, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter because the SCOBY is going to eat it all up and produce the probiotics. You're not actually going to end up drinking that sugar. So you don't have to feel like you need to get anything super fancy or anything like that. So see all those bubbles in there? That's the gas that's happening from the fermentation. So we know that this kombucha is a really happy one. In the summer, it's always easier because it's dependent on the temperature and all these sorts of things. So it takes less time to ferment. Ooh, there we go. Okay, and I do have some for you guys to taste. This one probably needs to stay for a few days in the fridge to really develop the flavor. I'll just do the rest of it, bless you. Just pour a little bit. Sorry. Now I'll show you, this is the secondary fermentation, so I'll show you how to do it. It's okay. Thank you. Thanks, Mom. So it's a happy batch, this one. Okay, all right. So now I'll show you this one you can drink. This is what you can actually drink, and you keep it in the fridge. You can start with, I don't know, a quarter cup, a half a cup a day, whatever you like. And now I'll show you how to make the next batch that's going to ferment while you're drinking all of this. So I'll just rinse this out and get some hot water. You just need boiling water to steep the tea. Yep. The caffeine does. The caffeine is also does get. That's why I give it to my kid. It does. It also gets metabolized, and yes, it produces a little bit of alcohol, but it's a very small amount, and I think it's completely safe once it's done all the things. So I'm just going to get a bit of hot water from here.
So you're saying that the cups of tea that I left
They could be gathering their own scobies in there. If you leave it for long enough, really, it could be. Okay, so this is just hot water. You want to do this in a glass container. It can't be metal or plastic because then the kombucha will leach out chemicals from there. Is that boiling water? Yeah, that's boiling water. I'll just get a little bit more. And then you just take, so for 2 liters of water, which is what I'm hopefully going to have here, you just use 2 black tea bags. Again, you can do like different flavors, and in all the like cafes and in the supermarkets, they have really fancy things with raspberry and lemon and other different flavors, but you totally don't have to because I feel like it's got enough of a yummy flavor of its own. Okay, let's see if that works. So just regular black tea I've got here. And where is my rubber band? I'll just put it inside there to just let it brew a little bit. And you just add, so again, this is going to be for a 2-liter amount, you need half a cup of sugar. And like I said before, it doesn't need to be anything fancy. Don't use honey because you actually need the sucrose. You don't need the fructose that's in honey. It's not going to work. So you just put the sugar in there. It's half a cup for 2 liters of water and 2 tea bags. Once this cools down to, like, you can stick your finger in there and you're not going to get burned, you'll put the SCOBY back inside here, and with the liquid that you reserved from there, you cover it back up and leave it. So right now, at the moment, at my house, it's taking about a week because, as I said, it's been warm. In the winter, it can take about 2 weeks to ferment. Like, you can take a little bit out and taste it and see, does it taste fermented enough to you? Is it acidic enough for you? And you'll see if it doesn't do these bubbles when you strain it off, that means it probably hasn't had enough time to ferment, or for some reason it's not so happy. And like I said, in the summer right now, it's all happening really quickly. So that's it. It's very simple. It takes 5 minutes.
The starter, what do you do for the starter?
Where do you get this?
Where do you get them?
From me. You can get some from me. You can get it from any batch of kombucha that you can get from the supermarket. You can start your own. You have a little bit of it, you put it inside here, and it will make a SCOBY because it's got the live.
Some very simple steps. How do you make the SCOBY to start with?
You don't make it. You have to get it from an existing batch.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
But in the supermarket,
Is there any amount that's recommended for the day?
To drink, like I said, start off small, like start off maybe with a quarter cup or something. It's not. I don't think that there's any, like, necessarily that you need to drink a cup and therefore you will have a really healthy microbiome. As we heard, everybody's microbiome is different, and I think any amount of this is already going to be really good. I think anything from like half a cup is perfect. It's great. But don't go drinking like a liter of it. Then that's going to be overkill. Yeah. I'll just take these 2 questions, and then I think maybe we'll have questions afterwards because we've got other, yeah.
So were you saying that you could buy kombucha from the supermarket?
Yes, right. Yes, you can. If it's got the little strands floating in it, some of them are actually pasteurized, which kills off a lot of the good bacteria, so it's kind of counterintuitive. But if you see they've got like these strands floating around in them, that's the SCOBY that hasn't made a big SCOBY like this. So you can use it to start your own batch. I'll just take Marcus and then...
I know you're not doing product endorsements, but which ones are those on the market?
I have no idea. I only make my own. I literally don't. I just make it at home. I'll answer the other questions afterwards because I feel like we should get on with other things. So maybe while Maryasha talks, I'll hand around some of the kombucha for you guys to taste. Okay? Thank you. I'll just... Can I take it?
Supermarkets, you've got to read the label because it will say kombucha style. It doesn't mean it's actually...
That's right. With everything. With everything. You have to read the labels with everything. Absolutely. I agree with you. Okay. I'll move over. Can I leave this stuff here? Or should I take it?
Bread. I feel a little bit bad for bread. I feel like it's had a bit of a bad rap the past 50 years. It's like in fashion and it's out of fashion and it's in fashion and it's out of fashion, and I'm a little bit sad for it. But the future is positive. Sorry, I'm not very used to talking in public. My name is Maryasha. I have been baking sourdough for about 6 years. One second. I lived in Israel for a while, and someone gave me some starter about 6 years ago, and they gave me a bit of a method. So I just started making it, and it wasn't very good. And so then I just went on a bit of a mission to try and like work out how to make better bread. So I'm actually a trained physio, I'm paediatric physio, but the sourdough kind of got me, and it's like taken over my life. So I'm just building I have a little bakery in my garage at the moment, and I'm sorting it out right now, and then after Pesach I'll just be having, hopefully, kosher, everything sourdough on Fridays. Okay, so I don't have like a slideshow. That was amazing, Irina. That was really amazing. And just got a bunch of little kids, so thank you so much. Before I talk about sourdough, I'm just going to talk about a bit of the history of bread. So when we talk about bread, not all breads are equal. So I'm just going to divide it into modern bread and ancient bread. So what Irina was saying, humans have been fermenting food ever since we've been eating food, because that's how a lot of the food needs to be eaten. It needs to be eaten fermented, including grain. So when I teach people this, if people thought this was how to make sourdough, this was not really the right forum to teach people how to make bread, because it's quite hands-on, it's quite a very complicated process. I teach that in small workshops, but it dawned on me while I was teaching, when I was trying to explain a starter, which this is my starter. This is one of my starters, and it's bubbly. You can all have a smell of it and a look of it later. It smells quite acidic. I realised how on Pesach, when we describe what matzah is, I remember sitting in school and they said that in Egypt, why do we eat matzah, was because we didn't have time to bake bread. We were running out. And I remember never understanding that. I was like, why? It just takes an hour to bake bread. And then only many, many years later did I think back to that, and I realised that they didn't have yeast back then. They didn't have what we call commercial yeast. And sourdough bread, it takes a very long time to bake. And also I realised when you make matzah has to be quickly made within 18 minutes. So I thought, why? Like, what happens in 18 minutes? If you just mix flour and water, it forms like a cohesive mass, but nothing happens. Like, you can't, like, bake that. And then I realised that it starts fermenting after 18 minutes. And that's really what a sourdough culture is. And Irina's spoken all about that, but it's just flour and water fermented. And it's a very new area. They really are only starting to understand what is a sourdough culture now. Like, they've just built a few sourdough labs around the world. People are sending their cultures in, and it's a very new area of understanding the culture. But actually, it's not only, it takes, how does it ferment and how does it become culture? And it contains the yeast that Irina mentioned, but it also contains lactic acid. It doesn't only, it contains both of those, if you remember those from a few minutes ago. And basically they're only realising now, like, how does it bubble, where does it become? And it's really not only, it's from the whole ecosystem. Like, I don't want to be disgusting, but they've even found, like, the same microbes in the sourdough starter are also in, like, bug poo and things like that. Like, it's just the earth that we live in contains all these living cultures, which is also how we give and take. They are only starting to understand it. But I'm going to call ancient bread previous to 50 years ago and then modern bread to 50 years ago. So until about the 18th century, all bread was kind of sourdough, which is another name for wild yeast or naturally fermented foods. And then they started adding, when they started adding some of the bits from beer into bread, they noticed that everything rose quicker and the crust was much softer. It wasn't so crusty, and people really liked that. So they started making yeast out of brewer's yeast and making that to rise their bread. And then in the 50s was the Industrial Revolution, where everything was industrialised and everything was quicker and faster and bigger, and the machines, the grains that we were growing couldn't keep up with the demand of the machines that were making the bread. So they started changing the grains that they used to grow to a grain that could be produced quicker, cut earlier. Then they started adding a lot of chemicals and processed things into the bread, like ascorbic acid and softeners and emulsifiers and this and that. So then we got our Wonder Bread, which is what is called modern bread. And that was the bread that so many cultures are considered bread. And if you look at the ingredients, it's also wrapped in plastic, suffocating in the supermarket. If you look at the ingredients of it, there's a lot of ingredients of the bread because we like it high and soft and delicious and everything. It doesn't look anything like this, and this is just flour, water, and salt. Also, bread sustained communities and cultures. They had a baker, and they had a mill, and they had a fire people would make it at home and bring it to the communal fire. It was sustained communities until very recently, and people did not have stomach aches. There was no intolerances to bread. It was like how communities were sustained forever. It's only very recent that there's so much like intolerances and gluten and this and that. I guess Irina's explained a lot of all those things that they don't know exactly what's going on with people and their stomach aches and bread, but they're trying to understand it. There's a lot of different theories. One of them is the grain, one of them it's the fermentation. So I'll just explain a wheat kernel. A wheat kernel has 3 layers. The outer layer is the bran. Then the heart of the wheat is called the germ. Are these familiar terms? Bran, wheat germ, wheat bran. And then the biggest part is called the endosperm. So the bran contains a lot of the fibre that we need for our gut that Irina mentioned. But in the 50s, they also changed the way that they milled grain. So until then, it was like stone ground. The community would have like a big mill, and it was stone ground. And even if it was finely ground, it still contained the entire wheat kernel in it. And then it changed to roller milled, which really just gets rid of everything except for the endosperm. So we've lost already, with the roller milled, we lost already a lot of the nutrition of the grain. Anyway, so basically the bread that's made with roller milled flour with all the additions, as opposed to sourdough. So naturally fermented bread, what happens is that the grain is given a lot more time to slowly release all the sugars. The lactic acid from the sourdough starter also neutralises a lot of the gluten. So what I was going to say, was that in the endosperm it's made of proteins and starches. I don't have prizes, but does anyone know what the protein in the endosperm is called? Anyone? Not Irina. It's called gluten. Gluten, yeah. So gluten is a protein, and it's made up of 2 different proteins, and they provide the characteristics of the dough of bread. Just the elasticity and the elongation. And so when we knead our dough, basically when you mix flour and water, it forms a mass. And then when it's kneaded, the gluten is formed, which provides a nice structure for when the fermentation happens, which releases the CO2. So it provides that structure of the air it holds the air of the bread, and that's what you have, is your bread is essentially made up of air and starch and proteins. And so the lactic acid neutralises a lot of the gluten. So they found that people that are gluten intolerant but not celiac can actually cope very well with sourdough. That's one of the theories. So I'll just explain a little bit about how sourdough works. I do workshops, and there's a lot of, when I started baking, I have to say I'm self-taught, and I had to work really, really hard to find like anything on how to do any of it. And I've watched the whole online community just exponentially like grow, and it's huge, it's huge. I've seen people have started blogs and written books and every day. So there's a lot of resources out there to make your own culture. It's quite tricky to make your own culture, but you can always get from me, and to make bread and all those sorts of things. But once it becomes a mother or a culture, which is kind of like how the SCOBY becomes, it's the magic that really just rises your bread. It's just added to flour, water and salt. It rises the bread over a long time. Sourdough is not always sour. That's just one type of sourdough. It's not always super crusty. Depends on kind of the recipe. Because of the time that it releases the sugars, it's a very different colour to like your Wonder Bread. Your Wonder Bread is not like an actual colour of bread. It's an overmixed, processed bread. And the crust as well. It's from all the sugars being released. And it's transferred from batch to batch to batch. And I can go into it a little bit more if anyone wants. I just want to end off. No, the end is, I'll take a question in a second. The end, I bought lots and lots of bread to try. But I just want to end off on a positive note that there's a community that I'm a bit a part of where it has started a conversation between the farmers of the grain and the millers and the bakers. And we actually meet like once a year or sometimes more often. It's very small and it's growing. It's with organic grain farmers as well. You know, most of Australia's flour is like kind of exported or imported, which is ridiculous. Like, we really should be using what we have just next door to us. It's like also with the pastry bakers who are getting butter from France, like when you have beautiful butter in Australia. Like, we're really trying to just keep everything a bit more sustainable. So, yeah, that community is growing, and the conversation didn't really happen before where the farmers didn't have that conversation with the bakers, sort of saying like, well, this is what I need, this is not working, we need this kind of grain. And also they reintroduced grains from before 1960s, which are called heritage grains. So I've made bread with the heritage grain. And the idea is to, like, for the theory that the grain that was grown after 1960 is also not fully fermented. It's like cut short and all those sorts of things. So the idea is to bring back the kind of grains and hopefully improve our microbiome. So yeah, you can try it over there. And when you try it, just because it's sourdough, there's a lot of like complexity of texture and flavour. So I just want you to like sit there for a little bit, smell it, taste it all the way down your throat. It's like a different kind of experience. Yeah. That's really all that I wanted to say. Yeah, question. So yeah.
I know that there's a lot of biodynamic flour out there now. Is that flour which is what you were referring to before with all the kernel and the
Well, no, that's like whole grain flours or stone ground flours have the whole kernel in it, even the white stone ground. Look, different bakers use all different sorts of flours with different protein contents for different needs. So you can't, it's very hard to like have a bakery of only one type of flour because cakes need a lower protein content, bread needs a higher protein content, but stone ground flour, which you can buy, I think the Wallaby flour, Lauki Wallaby in Coles, is stone ground, is more nutritious, yeah. And wholemeal roller milled, I think also has the whole husk. Firebrand sells Lauki, yeah.
Just with regards to your yeast, your culture.
Yeah.
So yours is from Israel?
Oh, no. This is actually, I have 3 children. This is actually my 4th child. It takes over my house because it requires caring for it. No, I've made a bunch and I've taken a bunch. This one's not from Israel, no, but it doesn't really matter. There's a lot of myths about sourdough starters. You know, people have 100-year-old starters that have been taken, which is pretty cool, but doesn't mean it's healthy, really. If it's not looked after well, it can be healthy, even if it's new. Well, now that they're investigating it, they've discovered that actually, for example, San Francisco is very well known for its sourdough. And they kept on saying, it's like the bagels. You can't make New York bagels outside New York because of the water. But now that they've taken lab samples from everywhere, they've seen that not all the starters in San Francisco have Lactobacillus San Francisco. Some cultures in Melbourne have Lactobacillus San Francisco. So I think it's a new area of research that they're only understanding. And it's like, I think it's breaking a lot of myths. So, yeah.
Bread making machines, the actual bread making.
Yeah, it doesn't really matter how you make bread. I think any homemade bread. Well, yeah, bread making machines. I've never used one. Thank you. It's just a style of bread, but yeah, old school style. Yeah.
Sorry, just to be clear, you were said before about baker's yeast, that, you know, in the 50s they became more industrial and started using baker's yeast. Are you saying that the yeast sachets that they sell in the supermarket, is that baker's yeast that people are using, or is that?
Yeah. No, the brewer's yeast was how they originally discovered how to make commercial yeast. Yeah. The baker's yeast is processed. Yeah, commercial yeast. So that's yeast, and this is called wild yeast.
So is there so I'm assuming that the dry yeast is less biodynamic, is that right?
Yeah. It's just more processed, yeah. But it can still be good for you as well. Well, if it's like a super quick rise with all these additives in it, then it's not fully fermented at all. It's not really fermented. So, yeah, the grain hasn't been given that chance.
Yeah, so that's to that gentleman's question about bread machines.
Bread machines, it's what you make in them that really is the difference. But you're not adding all those things at home that they do in like Wonder Bread usually. You don't often have like dough improvers and stuff. Dried yeast, yeah. Yeah. So that's commercial yeast, which is generally used. So sourdough is kind of like more artisanal bread, yeah. It's much more work. It takes a lot longer. It's kind of harder to control, which is why it's a lot more expensive. It's usually better flour, local, because the baker that's doing it is very passionate about this sort of stuff. So that explains why it's, more expensive as well. And some of them are wood-fired, which is a whole art in itself, yeah.
It's delicious.
Yeah. I'm sorry I can't teach you all how to make it right now. It just wasn't the right, but I can teach you how to eat it. Yeah.
How do we get help to sell this?
I will be, yeah. Yeah, I'm just starting, yeah.
Every time you make
It's just fermented flour and water. So basically, you let it sit out in the air in a warm temperature, and you feed it fresh flour and water every day, twice a day or every day, and depends on, fermentation is temperature dependent. Yeah, so if it's hotter, it will ferment faster. It's not so easy though. Like in the winter, it's very hard to make one from scratch. Warm. If it's warm, it will start very quickly. Yeah. It's literally just like dough, but it starts bubbling. Yeah, and then it just takes skill and practice to know when it's ready to use. It takes about 7 feedings, but yeah.
Can I ask a question? How does this bread compare as far as carbohydrate, protein compared to other breads, for example?
Yeah, well, it's low GI because of the way that it works with all the acids and stuff like that. It's the lowest low GI. Even white sourdough is much lower than the average commercial bread. Well, I was saying this is called bread, and the commercial bread is modern bread. They're really different. And it is low GI and less it neutralizes the gluten. It's not gluten-free, but your body copes well with it, yeah. As we could just see by the history of our culture, yeah, which lived on bread for thousands of years. All it is flour, water, and salt, and sea salt, and organic flour. It's not always organic, depends on how much it costs usually, but that's all. So I think that if there's no competition really to things that are in a plastic bag in a supermarket, but it's expensive. So we live in a time where there's almost kosher like proper sourdough, but there are options for people that can't afford it. So I'm not going to, that's very important bread as well.
In the supermarket, they sell sourdough at 50%?
Usually, sometimes. You have to, sometimes. There's one sourdough in a packet that doesn't have added yeast. Yeah. It's not a registered name sourdough, so a lot of breads that are called sourdough do have yeast added if you just read the ingredients, yeah.
Sorry, you mentioned we run workshops, so you're going to leave some details around.
I will, yeah, sure. Yeah.
Sorry, what was wrong with having added yeast in the bread?
It doesn't always leave the grain time to fully ferment. It kind of cuts that short. It doesn't naturally ferment. It's also got additives in it that are not natural additives, emulsifiers, things like that. That just basically change the culture of the bread. Well, a culture really is flour and water. So, yeah, it's just made of flour and water. It's just this. Yeah. So either it will say flour, water, salt, culture, or it will just say flour, water, salt. Yeah. So that's just a higher protein content. Yeah, remember I spoke about the protein, the gluten in bread? So bakers just use different wheat for what they need. So like, it depends on what you want to make.
But it's a bread flour in the supermarket.
Yeah. This kind of bread, yeah. I use bread. This is high protein content, yeah. Everyone, oh, yeah, sure. But everyone can also eat. I've got more to cut up. Yeah, I know. Well, does anyone have an actual black bread recipe from Russia? I'm counting on Irina's mum. But black bread, actually, you know what? I do make 100% rye bread, which a lot of people love. It's like there's two types of people in the world, like people that love 100% rye, people that hate it. Black bread, I think, has a lot of, it's colouring, it's got like molasses. I don't think it's a rye bread. I think it's got a bit of rye, but I'm trying to work that out. So it depends. Sometimes it's rye bread, sometimes it's just coloured white bread. Nothing's trademarked, black bread, sourdough. So yeah, people can write whatever they want really on their bread. But basically, bread is not our enemy, it is our friend. So you can reintroduce it back into your life in small portions if you like.
So would you call is fermented bread the same thing as sprouted grain?
No, sprouted grain bread is just, you just add sprouted grains to that. So sprouted grains are just, they basically, you're telling the grain that it's going to grow again. You're putting enough, it's going to germinate, so it gets all ready to germinate, so it increases all the water content and the nutrients, and then it starts sprouting, and then you stop it. So you're just getting very nutritious grain. And sprouted bread, well, either it's just added to normal bread, or it's like a kind of gluten-free where they just make a kind of mush and bake it.
Ezekiel bread, if it's real.
Ezekiel bread, I think, is gluten-free, right? Or sprouted wheat. It's not gluten-free, but I don't think it's not the same. It's different. It's not like a cooked dough. It's just a kind of mush of sprouted grains. Cool. So come and smell it if you like. This is a healthy one, so this is kind of what it smells like.
Well, just before you come up and smell and taste, I would like to thank Irina and Maryasha very much for their presentation tonight. When I was asked if I would thank them, I was delighted because last year I discovered that I had something wrong with my gut, and so I looked into fermentation, and I'm pleased to say it's made a great deal of difference. I even bought the book on how to make kombucha. Have I done it? No. Will I do it now? Maybe. And I have just this week come back from Ethiopia, where they make fermented bread, which is called injera, and it's made from teff, which is not one of the 5 grains that you have to avoid at Pesach, and it's fermented, and it's actually quite bubbly looking. A lot of people don't like it. I liked it very much. But anyway, thank you very much, Maryasha and Irina, for your presentation, and if you would like to accept this small gift, I would be very happy to give it to you.